Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents, the Australia Institute podcast where we're talking about just what the hell is going on in the economy. I'm Elinor Johnston-Leake, the senior content producer here at the Australia Institute, and while our chief economist Greg Jericho is still on holiday in Europe, lucky him, we've got our senior economist back again this week, Matt Grudnoff. Hello, Matt.
You're stuck with replacement Greg again.
Yeah. When's Greg back?
A couple of weeks.
Oh, okay. So you got a few more weeks.
One more after this one.
Okay, very good. Now, Matt, so things have been happening in Parliament this week. Parliament's sitting, and we had a beautiful and lovely display of democracy and cooperation this week.
Yes?
Yes, the Coalition, the Greens and the Crossbench have banded together to force the government to fast-track the delivery of 20,000 aged care packages.
The federal government has caved into huge pressure from all of its political opponents.
There will be 20,000 additional home care packages released between now and the end of October.
For weeks, the government has obfuscated. They've tried to hide the extent of the wait list.
Labor has been dragged kicking and screaming.
This has been a movable feast.
It's going to make an immense difference because many have been waiting for some time for a package. It's the difference between them going into hospital potentially.
This is very exciting.
It is very exciting.
Sounds great.
It's great to see the Parliament work the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, I love democracy.
Rather than just a dictatorship of 3 years.
Yeah.
Where we decide who's going to be the dictator. We actually have, a House and a Senate that works and changes stuff and makes stuff better.
Yeah, very exciting. So, Matt, what is actually included in these packages?
So these are home care packages. So basically they're for people who need care at home but don't want to go into a nursing home. So they might not be quite as needing to go into a nursing home. We found that it's better for people to be cared at home if that's the most suitable care for them. And so what had happened is the government had proposed some reforms for aged care. They had been delayed after consultation with the industry from July to November. But then the government had also delayed new at-home care packages, which the industry didn't need delayed and didn't want delayed. And the people out there didn't want delayed, and obviously the Parliament didn't want delayed.
Yeah.
And so the crossbench and the opposition got together and basically convinced the government that no, they shouldn't delay the home care packages. They should just delay some of the other reforms.
And bring the home care packages up sooner.
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah. So Matt, just as a whole, how is the aged care sector doing? You know, we've talked a bit about another sort of notoriously under-resourced and underfunded sector, childcare, quite a lot recently. How's aged care doing sort of in that regard?
Yeah, so home care packages are a great idea. Caring for people at home is absolutely a good way of doing it if their situation warrants it. But it suffers from the same problem that we often see in a lot of other care sectors, including the NDIS in disability care and also in childcare. And that is a situation where the government is paying the private sector to provide care to people. And the problem with this is often because the person receiving the care isn't actually paying for it, the private sector seems to overcharge and rip people off. And so we see it in the NDIS where people are overcharging and then so I should begin by saying there are lots of people in these care sectors. There are for-profit childcare centres who are really in for the right reasons. There are disability carers who are absolutely in it for the right reasons. There are aged care people who are absolutely in it for the right reasons. But it's a big pot of money and it can attract people who aren't. And the problem with that is they overcharge, they make big profits from it, and because they're in it for all the wrong reasons, they also provide really bad care. And we're having a big debate in childcare. All the sort of issues where really what it is about is it's about childcare centres cutting corners in order to try and make as much profit as possible. And then you have these kind of issues they have with all of the kind of abuse and the lack of regulation. Not so much the lack of regulation, basically people trying to cut corners around the regulations. And the problem with the care sector is you're always dealing with vulnerable people, whether it's small children, whether it's older people, whether it's disabled people. And they're not in the best position to advocate for themselves. And so really the problem comes down to the for-profit motive doesn't work in the care sector. And you've got to wonder, maybe it would be better if the government just provided the service rather than giving people who need aged care, who need disability care or who need childcare, rather than giving them kind of money to offer it to the private sector. What if the government just provided it? I mean, when we come to schooling, for example, the government mostly provides primary school education and high school education. Sure, there are not-for-profit private schools, right? Absolutely. But the vast majority of it is the government sector providing it. What if they did that in disability care? What if they did that in childcare? What if they did that in aged care? Then you get around the idea of people trying to rip them off. The government's not going to try and rip itself off, right? It's going to be in it for all the right reasons. It's going to be in it to provide good quality care. And I think that problems we are really finding, and I mean, you just have to follow all the Royal Commissions, the Royal Commission into disability care, the Royal Commission into aged care. You know, I mean, eventually we may end up having a Royal Commission into childcare, the way it's going. And you know, they all basically are running up with this same problem of the for-profit motive is causing all kinds of problems because you have people trying to rip money out of the system. I mean, just to give you an example, there are childcare companies that are enormous in Australia. Why are they enormous? Because they're a license to print money, because they have a guaranteed income stream from the government. It doesn't matter whether the economy is booming or doing poorly. The government is still going to pay for that childcare.
And people always need childcare. Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, there are CEOs of childcare companies who earn $3 million a year, right? These are enormous companies that are owned by international hedge funds that make huge rates of return. And the reason they're able to do that is on the back of taxpayer money. And we've seen they don't provide a particularly good service in many cases.
And from what I understand, pay pretty low wages most of the time.
Yeah, exactly right. So it's not like the workers are doing outstandingly well.
Financially wise, yeah.
Yeah, financially wise. So I think that, what we need is the government to look and say, well, you know, these markets aren't working. They're not working very well. And the government needs to reconsider how it spends its money. And it needs to think about what is the best way. How are we going to get the best value, not just for taxpayers, but also for kids and the elderly and the disabled.
Could the same be said for, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about increasing costs of the NDIS and how do we reduce costs there. Could government-provided services alleviate some of that?
Yeah, absolutely.
As well?
It's entirely possible. In fact, it's very likely that the government could provide this cheaper than the private sector because of how much gouging is going on. And, you know, as I said, the government is not going to be trying to gouge. It's not in it to make a profit. It's in it to provide quality care. And, you know, if the market was super competitive, if there were lots of firms who were doing their utmost to try and get, you know, your attention and make sure that you use their service, then absolutely you might actually get the private sector to do a good job. But in a lot of cases, I mean, with the aged care, with all the talk about the home aged care packages, there's been lots of stories about people who get a package and then struggle to find a provider to actually help them out. They're actually struggling to find anybody who will provide these services. And when they do find them, well, guess what? Because everybody's struggling to find one, then the company can charge an enormous amount of money for a service, and you know, that's not going to the aged care worker.
Yeah. And I suppose it's important to remember then, especially with all these discussions about the NDIS, it seems like a lot of the, not blame, but responsibility is put onto the people asking for the services or requiring the services for the ballooning costs and not so much the private providers.
Yeah, exactly right. When we come to the NDIS, it's the fact that we have, you know, it's rapidly growing and we need to cut it back and we need to reduce the services provided to the disabled. Well, what if we spent the money better? What if the government was more involved in providing those services and was able to provide better services at a lower cost? Well, then we could have more people on the NDIS, more people would be getting better services, and it wouldn't cost as much.
Yeah, sounds like a great idea to me. Efficient and providing better service. What more could you possibly want in economics?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Big national projects must consider who's best placed to bear the risk, and that is who should own what and when. One way this could work is for governments to build assets with the plan at the start to sell or lease them later to long-term investors like us, like super funds. Or as I'd like to say, build it to sell it. And I think that's a model very much worth exploring.
Also in the news this week, I'd like you to explain this to me because I'm not sure if I entirely understand what's going on because it seems a bit silly. At the National Press Club this week, the Australian Super CEO was talking about, if I understand it correctly, wanting the government to privatise government assets so superannuation funds could invest in them. Can you give me a bit of the backstory here?
All right, so let's go back slightly. The Australian superannuation system is very big. It has trillions and trillions of dollars. What it needs to do with that money is invest it somewhere in order to make a return to grow everybody's super. All right, so that's their objective. But when you get big enough, you start to run out of obvious options. Right, so you've got to find investment options. And one of the ideas that's come out of this particular CEO of this particular super fund is the idea that the government should invest in something, develop a business, whether it's, AI or supercomputing or infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, renewable energy. And then when it's up and running and profitable, they should privatize it and sell it off to super funds so that they can make money from it.
Okay.
Now, let's have a quick think about that. When is the worst time to be a business or the most dangerous time to be a business is very early on, right? So businesses at the start don't make a lot of money. In fact, they often burn through cash, right? And they have a lot of upfront costs and there's a lot of risk involved about whether or not it's going to work. What the super industry is effectively saying is the government and taxpayers, right, should take that little bit at the start when all the risk is, and the losses are. And then when it's not risky anymore, we should sell it off to the super funds, right, and privatise it effectively. And then the super funds, because often governments are involved in things that have, little competition, we'll take that little competition, we'll be able to charge large prices, and we're doing a good thing because we're actually helping you guys and your super. But actually we're helping by sort of gouging customers and not taking a huge amount of risk. So there's a lot of self-interest going on there, right?
Yeah. Is there what's the sort of impetus behind this though? Is the superannuation industry in particular trouble for finding investment opportunities or?
So there's a lot of pressure on them to invest in Australia, right? So the super industry actually invests a lot overseas. And the reason it does that is because it's quite large and there are lots and lots of investment opportunities. When I say the super industry is large, I mean large compared to Australia and investment options. If you look worldwide, there are plenty of places that it can invest and make a good return. But there's kind of this weird parochial thing in Australia that our super should be invested in projects only in Australia, which doesn't really make sense. A lot of projects aren't getting up because of a lack of investment funds. There's plenty of investment funds from all over the world and in Australia for good projects. A lot of projects don't get up because they're not financially viable. And so if you force Australian super funds to only invest in Australia, they have to go to increasingly projects that don't stack up. And so they're not going to make as big a return. So the kind of super industry sounds like it's basically saying, well, what if we kind of tested the water with these projects and we got the government to do the heavy lifting and then we just took them once they were profitable and made big profits for them? Or alternatively, another CEO was saying, well, why don't we just privatise more things? And the problem with privatisation, as you might guess,
as we've sort of brought up already.
Yeah, when we saw electricity privatised, when we had a big rush of privatisations in sort of the 90s, for example, what they actually led to was a whole heap of price gouging and not a lot of competition. Let's be clear, private industry loves the idea of government privatisation entirely because they're hugely profitable if you run them only to earn a profit. So the government runs the electricity sector not to make a huge profit, but to provide a good quality service to all Australians. The private sector, not so much. They're interested in providing electricity to everybody, but at a price that they can make a big profit from. So, sure, industry is going to want, including super funds, is going to want more privatisation. But let's be clear, those big profits come from somewhere, and that's from Australian customers getting gouged.
The government has been sort of suggesting, though, that super funds do start investing in things like housing and green energy, things like that. Is this sort of a response to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a response to this idea that the super funds should be investing in Australia. And again, look, there's no shortage of money to invest in housing. It's not like people go to their local bank and the bank says, sorry, we're out of cash this week. Come back next month. We'll have more cash then. There's plenty of money to invest and build new housing. The problem isn't a lack of funds. The problem is that, if you invest in particularly sort of public housing or social and affordable housing, which is what they're asking the super funds to invest in, they don't make big returns because by definition, they're renting them out to poorer people. So then the government has to come along and basically top up the super funds. So sure, the super funds get a bit from the renter after building the property, but then the government tops them up in various ways, whether it's through tax discounts or subsidies. So then you've got to ask, well, if the government's just paying for it, why doesn't the government just build it and make it public housing, right? And then they own the asset, that very asset that keeps appreciating in value. They own that. Rather than it, all those gains going to the private sector.
Well, then also the super funds might invest in something that might be more profitable elsewhere.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So and that's the other problem, right? So the super funds will only invest in something if it makes a certain rate of return. So the government, in order to encourage the super funds to invest in something that isn't making that rate of return, have to top it up. And that's basically when taxpayers go on the hook. And then you've got to ask, well, why doesn't the government just do it themselves?
That is something I ask myself a lot.
Yeah. Look, I mean, we've in this country over the last few decades, we've turned into people who are terrified, or the government is terrified of making any kind of investment. Whereas if you go back to the 50s and 60s and 70s, they were quite happy to get involved in the economy and provide things that they knew they could do it better than the private sector. Health, education, there are lots of areas in this economy that the government does it better than the private sector. We talked about them in the care sectors. The government does a better job than the private sector. Look, should the government be involved in, owning cafes? No. Okay, the cafe industry is obviously well serviced by the private sector.
Also not really an essential industry.
No, exactly right.
Yeah.
But there are certain industries, like you said, essential industries, where the government actually does the best job. And we know this because if you look around the developed countries, almost every developed country has a mainly government-funded health sector, except for one. Can you guess which one that is?
Oh, we'll talk about them a bit later probably, but it would be the United States.
Yes,
yep,
and they
famously
have the worst outcomes for health of developed countries, and they pay the most. They pay more than other countries.
Australia's economy grew by 0.6% in the 3 months to June 30, taking the annual growth rate to 1.8%.
The figures outstripped the expectations of economists.
It's a very welcome and substantial pickup in growth.
The national accounts for the June quarter came out, and this sounds very impressive. National accounts sounds like something that would be very interesting.
I can hear people's eyes glazing over, if you can hear
my
glazing.
Eyes are glazing. But Matt, can you unglaze my eyes? What's going on in the economy?
So national accounts is just GDP, gross domestic product, economic growth. So if you hear people talking about economic growth, they're talking about national accounts. So these figures come out every quarter, and they're basically the figures that show how the economy is going. And the economy growth was up, but before you get too excited, it was up from something that was very low to something that's only now slightly low. The economy is now growing at 1.8% a year. To put that in context, the long-run average is 3%. So 1.8% is a lot lower than 3%. But before this, it was only growing at 1.3%. So it's high. It's mostly the increase is being driven by consumer spending, which is exactly what we'd expect because guess what the Reserve Bank has been doing this year? It's been cutting interest rates. All right. We know that, when you cut interest rates, people with mortgages, for example, spend less on interest so they can spend more on other stuff. So more people are spending, which is stimulating the economy. There's a lot of talk about the growth rate is above what the Reserve Bank thought it would be. And so maybe the RBA might not be as keen to cut interest rates. But I think actually the reverse is true, right? I think that what the national accounts show is that the economy is currently being supported by the Reserve Bank cutting interest rates. And if we want to actually get anywhere back to normal growth, back to 3% growth, then they should continue to cut. I don't know whether they'll listen to me. Notoriously,
They usually don't.
They don't, no.
Yep.
But look, I mean, the next big data, like the next RBA meeting, I don't think they'll cut. As I said, I think last week or the week before, they keep cutting after the quarterly CPI is released. The next quarterly inflation figures, CPI, are coming out in the end of October, and the RBA has a meeting in November. If they're going to cut, that's when they'll cut.
Very good. All right. Well, place your bets.
Yep,
is the RBA
absolutely
going to listen to Matt?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be betting on what Matt said. Let's put it like that.
I mean, neither would I.
Vote of confidence there.
So you say that consumer spending is sort of the thing that's keeping the economy going at the moment. What are the other sectors that would normally be keeping the economy going that aren't?
Yeah, so we're exporting. Exports were up a little bit, so it was helping consumer spending. The other big ones should be government spending. Government spending was up a tiny bit, but government investment was down a tiny bit, so they basically cancelled each other out. And the other thing is private investment, which has been totally flat. Businesses, surprise, surprise, are not investing at the moment.
And why is that?
Because they're cowards. I think, look, I have,
Ouch.
we have this huge productivity conversation, and all the expectation is what can the government do to increase productivity?
Yeah.
What do the government do to increase productivity? It's private firms that increase productivity, and they do that by investing, and Australian firms don't invest. Why don't they invest? Because they're big fat oligopolies. There's little competition, and they can get away with gouging their customers. Why take a risk on an investment when you can just gouge your customers, make big profits, keep shareholders happy, and pull in your big CEO pay packet?
I fear I've touched a nerve here.
Yeah, look, Australian firms are crap at investing. If you look throughout history, we are investing as a share of GDP is way down. When you compare to other countries around the world, it's way down. And what's the difference? Well, we've just allowed big firms to combine with other big firms to make big oligopolies. Oligopolies are when there's only a few big firms that, dominate the market. Think airlines, think groceries, think banks, think insurance companies, think most of the big industries in Australia. And they can just gouge their customers and make a big, healthy, happy profit for them.
Maybe the divestiture laws that we talked about on the last episode?
Yep. Cut them up.
Yep.
So if you want to look at when competition works, right, take a look at the cafe industry. Across the world, Australia is known for its great coffee, right? Like this country in the arse end of the world, as Paul Keating once said, that has this fantastic coffee culture. Why? Because there's cafes everywhere.
Well, also, thanks to, I think Greek and Italian immigration.
Absolutely. It started with
great.
that.
Yep.
But there are lots and lots of cafes. And if you're a cafe out there and you produce bad coffee, even what would be considered reasonable coffee anywhere else in the world, you will go out of business, right? And so that's the power of competition. It forces firms to do a good job, keep their customers happy and keep prices down. And so there are plenty of businesses and industries in Australia that absolutely are competitive, absolutely are doing a good job. It's just that there are these giant industries that is not happening.
I mean, cafes do seem to be coming out with a different kind of fun drink every single week. There's
because they're trying new things. They're innovating.
The strawberry matchas and stuff like that.
They're investing.
See, this is what we can get with competition.
Yeah, exactly right. And so yes, investment in Australia is down. Business investment is down. It's down at historic low levels. It's down compared to other countries. And when people are talking about, well, what can the government do about productivity? The response should be, what is industry doing about productivity?
Well, what government can do, divestiture laws.
Yeah, they can introduce more competition.
Yeah, sounds great.
He's vowed to impose new tariff and export restrictions on advanced tech and semiconductors.
The president posting on Truth Social that dozens of nations are using digital service taxes to discriminate against American tech companies like Meta, Alphabet, and Amazon.
Bloomberg reporting has found that Mark Zuckerberg was lobbying President Trump on digital taxes before he launched another tariff threat. What can you tell us about that?
Who knew that lobbying works?
Well, just very quickly, we've got probably a bit of time for a very quick tariff corner. Donald Trump has said some more things like he does.
Oh, he's good at that, isn't he?
He says so many things. Yeah. He's threatened to introduce tariffs against countries that have digital taxes. What's he talking about here?
Yeah, so this is huge American tech firms that, speaking of uncompetitive industries, huge American tech firms that are basically in Australia, for example, have taken over the advertising revenue.
So things like, say, Google, Meta, Alphabet. Google,
all of those. They've basically taken over the advertising. They funnel all of the advertising revenue into tax havens, effectively, and they don't pay a lot of tax in Australia. That's obviously hurting our media because media used to rely on advertising. And so the response to that in Australia was the Media Bargaining Code, which was forcing these big tech platforms to pay for the content that media in Australia were producing as a way of trying to fund media. But in other places, you could just stick a tax on these big tech companies. You could stick a digital tax on them and say, well, as a percentage of your turnover, the money coming out of Australia, we're just going to take a slice of that because we know you're going to siphon it off somewhere else. So let's take it before you siphon it off. Well, Trump doesn't like that because guess what? They're almost exclusively American companies in that they originated in America, not that they're, in those countries for legal purposes anymore. They're in all sorts of weird countries for legal and tax purposes. So he's threatening basically tariffs on countries that are introducing any of these kind of digital taxes, including things like Media Bargaining Code. My advice to the government, ignore him. Australia has every right to tax Australians paying for advertising. That's Australian companies advertising to Australians in Australia. Why shouldn't the government be able to tax that?
All right. Well, thank you, Matt. I feel like you got a fair few good rants in there. Well, this episode of Dollars and Cents was recorded on Thursday, the 4th of September. If you want to look at any of our research into things like aged care and divestiture laws, superannuation, you can go to australiainstitute.org.au. Our music, as always, is from Blue Dot Sessions, and we'll see you all next week.
Bye.